Naturally, there's a dividing line in Nottingham Forest's history set before and after the arrival of Brian Clough in 1975. We all know what he did at the City Ground, champions of England, twice champions of Europe. What few do know is what Nottingham Forest were like before 1975. This is that story. Here's your book recommendation for this week. It's Don Wright's Forever Forest, the absolute best and most comprehensive history on the club. It was the 1860s where football came to Lacetown and became the most popular pastime in the industrial city. By the middle part of the decade, we had two formal football teams that still stick about the place today. Notts County forming in 1864, Nottingham Forest following the year after. Of course, we're here to talk about the latter. Very much of their time, Forest choose the Garibaldi red thanks to the Italian unification legend Giuseppe Garibaldi, and they were almost immediately at the races. In their first two entries into the world's oldest football competition, the FA Cup, Forest ventured out into the semi-finals, first going down to Old Etonians 2-1 in March 1879 before following that one up 12 months later against Oxford University. 5 years later they replicated the feat, this time getting a draw against Queen's Park. Unfortunately, it would not be third time lucky as they fell 3-0 in the replay. By the 1890s though, there were other means to material success as the Football League was formed. In 1892, Forest could count themselves as one of the 28 teams when they won the Football Alliance. 3 teams would be fast-tracked into the First Division. The Wednesday earned the most votes with 10 and Nottingham Forest got 9, both ahead of league teams Accrington and Stoke, as well as the eventually elected Newton Heath, who of course would go on to become Manchester United. Forest then spent the next 6 years bobbing about the top flight of English football, safe from the perils of relegation and re-election, without making much of a dent in the FA Cup since their 1892 semi-final loss in a second replay against West Bromwich Albion. The 1897-98 campaign would change all of that. Grimsby Town and Grimsby Trinity both dismantled in the earlier rounds before revenge had been sworn against West Brom in the quarter-finals. It had proved fifth time lucky for Forest in the semis, drawing the first game at Bramall Lane with Southampton 1-1 before dispatching of the Saints down at the final venue, Crystal Palace 2-0 in a blizzard. With Southampton's demands of a replay thrown out by the FA, Forest returned 3 weeks later, dispatching Steve Bloomer and his Derby County team. Arthur Cape's the man with a cup-winning brace. It would be well over half a century by the time Forest returned. In the meantime, they took advantage of their newfound glory by moving into what was their umpteenth home in 30-odd years when the City Ground was moved into that summer. They obviously remain there to this day. At the turn of the century, Forest had secured themselves at both ends of the pitch. Grenville Morris and Jack Calvey would score the lion's share of the goals, whilst Harry Lineker kept goal. Entering the spring of 1901, it appeared as though Forest would have to make room in the trophy cabinet as they returned home from Bury victorious to end March, well-positioned joint top of English football alongside Sunderland. They would win just one of their remaining 5 games, ultimately sinking to 4th position, even below a little-known team called Notts County. It ought to have been an empire that Forest were building after their cup success in 1898. After all, they returned to the semis in 1900, only to lose 3-2 to Bury before replicating that the year after their title capitulation, this time losing to Southampton, who were more than happy to twist the knife in. It wasn't for footballing reasons that Nottingham Forest descended from what could have been their perch atop English football, but for a blazing fire that completely destroyed the main pavilion at the City Ground in July 1904. From regular finishers within the top 5, Nottingham Forest would eventually find themselves relegated in 1906 after a 4-1 defeat at Goodison Park. The club was doing just about anything to scrape together the cash to survive, hosting an FA Cup semi-final between Everton and Villa in 1905 before weeks later touring South America, a move which indirectly bestowed Independiente with the red and white they still wear today. Don't worry about Forest, however. Grenville Morris was still sticking in the goals and they would return the club immediately back to the First Division at an absolute canter, 12 points ahead of Leicester Fosse. They'd return with the top goal scorer in the First Division Division 2 as Enoch West rattled in 26 goals to top the scoring charts in the 1907-08 season before he added another 25 the campaign after in what were ultimately mid-table seasons. It was not long before they were back in the second tier after a disastrous run of form to end the season, 1 point from their final 13 matches, which plucked them from 9th to rock bottom. Before the war halted football in 1915, Forest showed virtually no signs of returning in a hurry, placing between 15th and 20th. The resumption of football saw no change in Forest fortunes, again in the bottom 6 with a 4th consecutive first-round elimination from the Cup secured in the 1920-21 season. Later that year, however, Sam Hardy was signed by the club for £1,000. The 38-year-old goalkeeper would have an enormous say on their promotion back to the top flight in 1922. The club conceded just 30 goals, even in a time of suspicion around a lack of goals. Forest's record was just 1 goal shy of a Football League record for a 42-game season held by Bristol City from the prior campaign. There was peace in Europe, there was momentum on the Trent. Now was the time for Nottingham Forest's resurgence. You'd have thought so anyway. After 2 seasons of struggling against the tide of relegation, West Brom finally put them out of their misery 3 games from the end of the 1924-25 campaign. In their absence from the top flight of English football, Forest completely retooled their half-back line. Billy McKinlay and Tommy Graham would both make their debuts in 1927 and go on to make well over 600 combined league appearances for Forest. Meanwhile, Bob Pugh completed the set when he signed in 1931. Up top there was Johnny Dent, signing in 1929 for what was still quite a sizable £1,500. It'd prove a bargain after he bagged himself 122 goals in 207 games, top scoring for the club in 3 separate seasons. And still there was absolutely nothing to shout about outside of 3 FA Cup quarter-finals before war returned to the continent. First it was eventual winners Bolton in 1926, 2 years later it was 1925 winners Sheffield United, and then in 1930 it was perennial league champions Sheffield Wednesday. All the while, Forest languished in the bottom half of the second division. Across the river, Notts County were in even worse shape. By 1932, they were residing in the 3rd Division South, and with football faltering on the Trent, talks of a merger between the two was whispered about. It never did come to fruition. By the end of the 30s, Forest looked serious contenders to be joining their neighbours in the 3rd tier of English football. After 2 bottom 4 finishes and relegation a real possibility, David Martin, the heir apparent to Johnny Dent's goals, came up massive on May 7th, 1938. With a point needed to stay in the division against the team directly beneath them, Martin netted twice against Barnsley. His second 5 minutes from time, the difference as Forest stayed up by 2/1000ths of a goal. Whoa! What is it good for is what Bruce Springsteen sang, and for Nottingham Forest, well, it would at least put a pause on a clear trajectory towards the 3rd tier after another 20th place in 1939. During the conflict, Forest had been dredged out of the red by a committee member called Mr. H.R. Cobbin, who wrote the club an enormous cheque to stave off their debts. It didn't harm the club either way that Sailor Brown had passed through the club for a season, netted 17 goals and was able to spin the club a tidy profit before moving on to Villa. But when league football resumed in 1946, Forest would only temporarily return to mid-table, quickly swapping that for more relegation scraps in the late 40s. By 1949, Nottingham Forest had entered the 3rd tier of English football for the first time in their history. Their final day win at home to Bury was not enough, as Leicester snuck a late result in Cardiff to relegate their local rivals. Thankfully, when Forest were plunged into the chaos of the 3rd tier, Billy Walker was the man at the helm, ready to steer them back. From spending record amounts of money, Forest were now having to rely on handouts from supporters so they could buy a new kit. Ultimately, they would have to sell off prized assets in George Lee and Jack Edwards to stay afloat. By 1951, he had done so. In Willie Ardron, they had found themselves a prolific goalscorer as the club found the net a mammoth 110 times. In addition to Forest reserves teams smashing its way through the Midland League, scoring 103 times, 9 points ahead of second place Rotherham United. The front line consisted of Wally Ardron, Tom Johnson, Freddie Scott, Tommy Capel and Colin Collindridge remained insatiable in the 2nd tier, where they maintained a place within the top 7 in the first 3 campaigns back. With such a powerful squad, Billy Walker was reluctant to add too much to it. As such, Alan Orr and Noel Kelly were the only acquisitions that summer. Then you had Billy McKinley's nephew Bob breaking into the squad, and there was more than enough for Forest to be competitive. Entering December, Forest were well stationed in 5th after roughly half of the campaign, ready to pounce on any slip-ups. Then Colin Collindridge went and broke his leg and was out until Easter. Still, Forest continued in their charge to the top of the division, leading the table after a March 15th victory over Coventry City. Sadly though, they'd win just 2 of their remaining 8 fixtures to wind up in a still creditable 4th place.
In comes the centre, the goalie misses, and Moore races in to slam it in.
But for the ability to grab that footage as Notts County finished a lowly 19th, there wouldn't be a whole lot of positives to be gleaned from the 52-53 campaign as Forest regressed to 7th in search of a promotion back to the big time. It was clearly the end of an era. Wally Ardron wasn't getting any younger, he played just 50 matches as Alan Moore deputised for him magnificently, grabbing 29 goals. Also, there was a small matter of the club losing both Tommy Capel and Colin Collindridge to Coventry City. Earmarked to replace Ardron, Ronnie Blackman was signed from Reading for $8,000 in the summer of '54. He'd carved out a reputation for being goal hungry. 39 strikes in a single season for the Berkshire club would do that, but he would wound up playing even less than Ardron, playing 2 fewer league games before being shipped off to Ipswich Town in the 3rd tier. As a result, the league season was a disaster, descending from 4th place all the way down to 15th, finishing so far beneath Notts County that we can't fit them in on the screen here. There was a shred of positivity to take from the FA Cup as both Sheffield United and Hartlepool United were dispatched. In the 5th round, however, they were eliminated by Newcastle United, the team of their era, but it did take 3 games for Forest to be beaten. The belated improvement of the front line came in Jim Barrett, $7,500 from West Ham, acquired midway through that season. He top score for the club in the next 3 campaigns. All in all, it meant 10 more goals added to their league tally and a climb back up to 7th, only 5 points off the promotion pace of Leeds United. As Barrett continued to bang in the goals, a real replacement for Ardron made himself known, and he had been there all along. Tommy Wilson was switched from the wing to centre forward, helping himself to 14 goals. The next season, Forest got off to an impeccable start, unbeaten in their first 7, and not only that, they were obliterating teams, 4-1 against Orient and Swansea, 5-1 against Bristol City. A few defeats in the latter weeks of 1956 or the returning distraction of the Cup would not hinder Forest. Yeah, in between Cup progressions against Portsmouth and Barnsley, Forest made time to twat both Port Vale and Barnsley 7-1 in successive games. And with that latest win in the Cup, it meant the television cameras came to town.
Forest. Then the long-range Forest shot goes over the top. Leading goal scorer for Birmingham, Govan gets across the flank centre, but it brings no reward.
Sadly, that footage isn't the pivotal replay at the City Ground. Then again, Birmingham did sneak a 1-0 win, leaving Forest without the Cup for the 49th consecutive season. But there would be silverware waiting for them, as their unbeaten start to league football in 1957 would be enough for Forest to get over the line and into the top flight. They were back in the big time, they'd finally mended their ailing front line, and now they were stocked and ready to go on numerous fronts. Nottingham Forest were back. Tommy Wilson was banging in the goals, and it was quickly apparent that they weren't here to make up the numbers. In fact, Forest lost just 1 of their first 8, even going so far as to slap Burnley about a bit 7-0 at the City Ground before sinking recent champions Portsmouth at Fratton Park 4-1. Unfortunately, losses would soon return to the club as the Knights drew in what would become a rare win at home to Sunderland on December the 7th. The season looked to have spun on a dime thanks to Jim Barrett's torn knee ligaments. Forest, though, hung on in there, struggling to enough results to make up a safe mid-table finish, a good return under the circumstances. Nottingham Forest are the answer to the quiz question, who were Manchester United's first opponents after the Munich air disaster, as only Harry Gregg and Bill Foulkes lined up for United at Old Trafford from their previous league match 3 weeks prior. The truce of a 1-1 draw seemed fair. That summer, Billy Walker went big in the transfer market and returned with almost £30,000 worth of new signings. In from Sunderland came Joe McDonnell, whilst Grimsby Town's Jeff Whitefoot was added, and Elton John's uncle, Roy Dwight, was the costliest yet at £14,000. It had been a middling season that Forest appeared only to be growing into by the turn of the year, as they sat 8th and only 5 points off the pace set by the perennial favourites Wolves, who were governed by Stan Cullis. Then the Cup showed up, and everything changed.
Clearance went straight to Granger. He ran it into the net. Tooting were 1 up. Amateurs played like men inspired.
Ted Murphy volleyed a terrific shot to score from 35 yards out. Tootingham Mitcham 2, Notts Forest 0.
Yes, that really is Tootingham Mitcham, who had never reached this stage before but had eliminated 2 league opponents, and they went 2 up here, but Forest pegged them back and took them back to the City Ground 2 weeks later, eliminating them. Grimsby Town were far more comprehensively eliminated 4 days later in the 4th round, and whilst it took 3 games to beat Birmingham, it had been another comeback saving Forest late on in the first game, viewed by 55,000 at St Andrews. The tie was finally sealed in the 3rd game at Filbert Street, emphatically too, 5-0. Weeks later, Birmingham would have a modicum of revenge, beating Forest 7-1 in the league. Next were the holders of the Cup, Bolton Wanderers, and once again, as he often did, Tommy Wilson was crucial in finding the winning goal to dump out the favourites, and so to Hillsborough to meet Aston Villa.
Wilson put the ball across to Quigley. He brought it under control, shot, and it was in the net.
Villa were the club that Billy Walker had won the Cup with 39 years previously as a player, and with Wednesday, the club he won it with as a manager. Now he had the chance to get it for the 3rd time, waiting for them in their first ever visit to Wembley, a Luton Town team that they could be called favourites over.
Wilson's in the middle. Well, take it back. Get it back. Ray.
Nottingham Forest hadn't won a trophy in 61 years, but it was well worth the wait. The same 11 that had played the entire way through the competition, but would never play together again. Wright's injury took him out of action for a year, and would result in him playing just twice more for the club. The subsequent 59-60 season was an understandable hangover, as Forest just about managed to survive the drop ahead of Leeds United by a point, as their Wembley nemesis Luton Town went down bottom of the pile. That summer, Billy Walker moved upstairs, with health failing, with arguably his star player Tommy Wilson, top scorer in the past 3 years, joining him in departing that September. Next into the dugout was the former Huddersfield and Carlisle manager Andy Beattie, after Harry Catterick wasn't able to be persuaded out of Hillsborough. Beattie was only able to conjure up 2 wins before mid-November, as the club were forced to rally in the second half of the campaign just to stay safe in 14th. With it, a bizarre qualification into the Fairs Cup as the highest ranked team from Nottingham, which was safe to say in every year really. This jaunt into Europe though was stopped at the very first hurdle against Valencia, comprehensively 7-1 on aggregate, in an otherwise nondescript season that saw Forest just 4 points above the dotted line back home. In the following 62-63 campaign, however, Forest improved in the league, finishing well within the top half, and could even boast an appearance in the quarter-final of the Cup, eliminating Wolves, West Brom and Leeds before ultimately being found out after 3 games against Southampton. That summer it was the turn of former Manchester United player Johnny Carey to attempt to steer the club in the right direction. By now it wasn't a club short on goals, as Frank Wignall was signed to add to Colin Addison, as well as the emergence of a certain Ian Storey-Moore. The result, another cosy season in mid-table. And despite the footage I've just shown you, the 64-65 campaign was record-breaking. Forest acquired a record points tally of 47, even if they didn't register a best-ever finish, only landing in 5th place behind the likes of Everton, Chelsea, Leeds and the eventual champions, Man United. The 65-66 season started well before it started, with a centenary tour of North America taken in New York, St. Louis, Chicago, San Francisco, LA, Vancouver and Toronto. Successful on and off the pitch, the real season began well too. Forest 4-2 victors at home to Manchester United. Such were the inconsistencies of Forest, they'd soon slum it in the lower reaches of the table, flitting wildly from the great afternoons as aforementioned to the crippling lows of getting pumped 5-0 at places like Ewood Park in November. The club were more than willing to seize their moment, however, as Joe Baker signed for a club record £65,000 from Arsenal in the March of '66.
And Forest playing now. Moore, he scored a great goal by Moore.
A brilliant shot by Jimmy Green.
The 66-67 campaign would go down as the almost double season. In the league, results like home triumphs against Man United in October, Arsenal in November and Everton on Boxing Day had them only 3 points off the pace at the turn of the year. When the cup returned, Forest were comfortable in dispatching of Plymouth and Newcastle, while Swindon took 3 games and Everton were squeaked by. Unfortunately, it was Jimmy Greaves who proved the end of the line for Forest's third cup ambitions as they were ejected out of the semi-final by Spurs. But as they picked up the pieces, Forest had 3 league games left and a 5-point deficit to make up on leaders Manchester United with a game in hand. An already insurmountable looking task was ended by Southampton defeating them at the Dell. It meant a return to Europe by actually qualifying on merit this time, and this time they went beyond the first round, thrashing former European Cup finalists Eintracht Frankfurt before ultimately being eliminated in the second round. It was a campaign interrupted after Peter Grummett broke his arm in an FA Cup loss at Leeds. He'd missed the remainder of the season in goal, returning for the second game of the subsequent season against Chelsea, only to break his thumb immediately. And it got worse for Forest as their hosting of Leeds on August 24th had to be abandoned because the main stand was engulfed in flames. Naturally, form slumped, and by the end of the year, Johnny Carey was gone. The £100,000 signing of Jim Baxter, a legend up north but past his peak down in England, distracted the club further as they finished 18th. Matt Gillies was hired, a man who had masterminded Leicester's charges to Wembley and silverware. A combination of the new man in the dugout and the goals from Ian Storey-Moore helped confirm survival in the top flight in 1969. As the 60s became the 70s, Forest settled for beige mid-table seasons with nothing to shout about, as their one flickering light remained Ian Storey-Moore, whose goals continued to flow. But midway through the 71-72 season, there was a very public tug-of-war over the forward. A certain Brian Clough had him paraded around the baseball ground, only for him to move to Manchester United after a £200,000 bid from them was also accepted. Despite losing their talisman halfway through the season, he still top scored for Forest as they miserably went down. In the latter weeks of 72, however, former Derby captain Dave Mackay replaced the outgoing Gillies, representing somewhat of a coup as he was unable to drag them out of mid-table in the second division. Ultimately, before he got a chance to show his managerial prowess, he was off. In October 73, a chance presented itself for Mackay to return to the baseball ground and succeed championship-winning manager Brian Clough, so he took it, going on to win the league title in under 2 years for Derby.
Now Johnson. An absolute gift!
Despite that thrashing, the 73-74 campaign was all about the cup as mid-tableness continued. Without Storey-Moore now, the onus was on Duncan McKenzie to dazzle the City ground. And after sticking fours beyond both Bristol Rovers and Manchester City, Portsmouth were beaten to take the club into a bizarre 3-game spectacle against Newcastle United in the quarter-final.
And 2 similar goals from Supermac against Burnley in the semi-final meant that Newcastle were back at Wembley after 19 years.
Long story short, Forest led at St James's Park 3-1 in the first game, only for a pitch invasion to threaten an abandonment in the north-east. When the players returned, Newcastle staged an incredible comeback to seemingly win 4-3. Only the FA demanded the game be replayed in full, with the second outing drawn at Goodison Park and the eventual footage you've just seen finally putting an end to the whole ordeal. Newcastle will go on to get shagged 3-0 in the Wembley final in Bill Shankly's last big outing as Liverpool boss. Of course, Duncan McKenzie's 28 goals wasn't going to go unnoticed, and he was quickly signed by Don Revie and Leeds United. In the meantime, Forest continued their squelch in the second tier, descending to 16th, their worst position since their 1951 promotion from the 3rd division.
Forward by Cottam, Bowyer's header, and Neil Martin coming in, Bowyer! Curling in, Cottam there, and he's got it in!
And to learn all about Brian Clough's time at Nottingham Forest, click on one of these videos.